Hi, and welcome to this conversation on sovereignty, Palestine, and internationalism in a time of genocide. My name is Giuliano Fiori, and I'm the director of Alameda, an international institute founded in 2023 that connects research to political organization. And I'm joined today, very pleased to be joined today by two wonderful colleagues, Yara Hawari, who's co-director of Ashabaka, and Tarek Bakoni, who's a writer and president of the board of Ashabaka. Ashabaka is the first transnational Palestinian think tank, a policy network. And today we're going to be discussing themes that are relevant to projects that we're both working on, endeavors that we're now trying to focus on. Ashabaka is increasingly focusing on South-South cooperation and solidarities in the South and global majorities in relation to Palestine. Alameda is working on questions of sovereignty and international order and their relationship to internationalism. We're having this conversation in South Africa, which we feel is very appropriate, not least because South Africa obviously experienced apartheid for many years, and international solidarity was key to the struggle against apartheid. But also, South Africa has obviously taken the case against the genocide in Palestine to the ICJ. So, thanks again to both of you for being here for this conversation today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
We've got a number of themes we want to get through, so we'll get stuck in straight away. And I thought we could start by giving things a slightly more personal touch, because we're each in different ways products of experience of displacement, of exile, and that produces often different tensions with respect to questions of nationality, nationhood, even national liberation, but sovereignty too. And so I wanted to ask each of you, maybe starting Tarek with you, how you've engaged with these themes of nationhood, nationality, and some of the tensions that have emerged in your own experience.
Well, first of all, thank you for having us. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Maybe I'll start with a personal take, actually. I'm Palestinian, the descendant of refugees from Haifa and Jerusalem, but grew up in the Shatat, grew up in the Palestinian diaspora uh, between Lebanon and Jordan. And so my sense of Palestine and Palestinianness was in some ways detached from land. It wasn't about being in the homeland, being in Palestine, but it was a political identity, and it was a very much a social identity, a cultural identity. And that's how I think I relate in many ways to the sense of nation. It's the people and the communities that form for me what formed the sort of the Palestinian communities that I grew up in. And obviously, as I became more politically active, it's very much tethered to the land, and it's about reclaiming the land and going back to the land. This question of return, but in terms of the Palestinianness as a sort of a way of being, as a political project, is not just tethered to the land. It's more expansive than that, and it's about the people, and it's about the politics of what Palestinianness means.
Yeah. And how about you? Yeah.
Well, I have a slightly different experience to Dara. I grew up in Jerusalem. I'm originally from a small village in the Galilee, but grew up in Jerusalem until I was about 11. So I have a very strong attachment to the land of Palestine, but it's also very fragmented. My social life was very much sort of geared towards Jerusalem and the West Bank, as opposed to where all my relatives lived, which is in the 48 territories. And when I was 11, we moved to the UK, and I didn't move back to Jerusalem until about 12 years after moving to the UK. Yeah, and I think my first experience of meeting Palestinians in the diaspora was much later. It was at university. So it took me a while to understand that there are different experiences of Palestinianness. And that understanding came through sort of contact with, Palestinians in the diaspora. Um, and it's, the Palestinian experience is defined by displacement, by fragmentation, and there are so many different facets to it. And even though I grew up in Jerusalem, I feel a strong attachment to Jerusalem. I'm not from Jerusalem. People know that I'm not from Jerusalem. I don't have a family name from Jerusalem. So I can't define myself as being from Jerusalem, even though that's probably the place where I feel most at home.
Mm.
And I've found that as I've grown older, I sort of identify more with my village. I have a sort of a big sense of pride around my village and where I'm from. And I've never lived there. And people sort of see me as people in the village, know that I'm from there, but also see me as an outsider in a way. And then, a lot of people sort of kind of place me in a category of being a diaspora Palestinian, which I've never categorized myself as because I didn't even know that was a thing until I was, 18, 19, 20. I mean, I think the first time I met someone who was Palestinian who hadn't grown up in Palestine was, at university.
Mm.
So there's a lot of, different facets to being Palestinian, but we also, we share that commonality of having a very difficult and intimate experience of displacement and exile.
Yeah, I myself have a very different experience of exile. My parents were exiled from Latin America under dictatorship. My dad and his family were exiled from Brazil soon after the military coup, and they went to Chile, and that's where my dad met my mum, and then they were exiled from Chile after the military coup, and ended up in the UK, which is where I was born. But of course, that experience, even temporarily, is much shorter, and it doesn't involve the dispossession of territory of nationhood. It involves a dispossession of identity and the enforced confusion of people's identity. And one of the legacies of that confusion, I think, often in second generation migrants like myself, is that there is, on the one hand, this connection and longing for connection to the place from which my parents came. And culturally, I was always very connected to Brazil. I have a lot of family in Brazil and now live in Brazil. Um, but on the other hand, this disposition, which is kind of cosmopolitan and a connection to something that's more disparate, difficult to intangible, difficult to identify myself, and that sometimes even reinforces the sense of connection to territory or wanting a connection to territory. I suppose it also modifies slightly the way in which I've understood the position of the places in which I grew up, the UK, in relation to the world, and the place from which my parents were exiled in relation to the world. And so I wanted to ask both of you, how do those experiences affect your view on Palestine in the world, Palestine in an international and imperial order of states, for example? Maybe Yara, you could start.
Yeah, I mean, I moved to the UK when I was 11, and I think that was very formative for me politically, and how also very formative in the way that I understood Palestine in a global context. I moved in I think I arrived in 2001, so
Mm.
the year of 9/11. It was really difficult to be an Arab kid at a British school in those at that time. Um, and no one knew what Palestine was. It was quite interesting. Like at my school, which was just a very ordinary school, um, people always thought that I was from Pakistan because they would ask me, and I'd say Palestine, and they'd say, "You mean Pakistan?" So that was Palestine for me growing up as a kid was the center of my world. Like I knew I was Palestinian. I thought it was everything. I was very lucky to have a relatively privileged childhood in the context of military occupation, of course. So I think there was a lot of I went through a lot of realizations that actually Palestine isn't the center of the world for a lot of people, for most people. But also just I think growing up I sort of realized all these connections and how it was all related. The Iraq War, like I felt that was a very uh, significant moment in my life. I think I came into being politically. through experiencing that. I remember going on demonstrations before the UK invaded, thinking that this isn't going to happen. There's millions of people. I was on that march where in London where there was 1 million people, and I was thinking this is not going to happen. Like, it's impossible. The government can't go to war against Iraq if so many people are against it. And it felt so incredible. I remember feeling so empowered in that demonstration, and then immediately crushed. And it sort of really fed into my understanding of Palestine and how what was happening in Palestine was allowed to happen. So that's kind of like the context of me, sort of how I became politicized and how I became to sort of understand Palestine in a more global context.
Right. Sorry.
I mean, it's interesting. I had a similar experience. 2003 was my radicalizing moment as well. Not 9/11, even though I was also in the UK. I had gone there to study. But I want to, so I think that was the moment where I understood that being Palestinian or embodying a Palestinian identity is not a neutral identity.
Right.
That it's an explosive identity, and it's one that is very disruptive, and it has political connotations whether you like it or not. You can't embody neutrality.
Right.
So I think that was the beginning of my politicization around not just Palestine, but Palestine was definitely the entry point for me into politicization. But I want to go back to something you said about the sense of dislocation of being from the land but not being on the land, this sort of sense of being in exile. I mean, my parents, obviously, my grandparents were ethnically cleansed, and my parents were then fled the civil war from Lebanon to Jordan, and so this sense of where is land, I think I wasn't aware that I carried that within me, but was unaware that I was carrying it within me. The sense of dislocation that there is. I'm clearly Palestinian. Everything around our home, the sensibility, the food, the culture, the affect, is as it's a Palestinian home, but Palestine is inaccessible. And the only time I was able to go to Palestine was when I was in my mid-30s after I had naturalized in the UK. So I needed the British passport to go back into Palestine. Sort of thinking about how colonialism is inherited, from the British mandate. My grandparents are dispossessed, and now under the current colonial regime, I need sort of this older ancestral regime to sort of let me in. And so it's sort of thinking about what this dislocation means. And I had understood politically and in all the ways that I was Palestinian. But when I landed in Palestine for the first time, having been organizing on it for years, having been studying it for years, it felt like I had been there before. I remember Yarna was one of the first people to sort of to host me and sort of just some of the comrades and the friendships that I started upon arriving on the land. And it was this intense familiarity, not in not in a nostalgic sense, but it just felt viscerally familiar. It just felt like everything I had grown up embodying somehow now in the land around me. And I think there's something about that, about exile, that because there's always this fear of nostalgia. The people in exile are nostalgic about a place that often no longer exists. And in many ways, that's true. The Palestine today is not the Palestine of my grandparents or the Palestine that existed before the Nakba. But there was still something about being present on the land that was intensely, it was very powerful. And it felt like a homecoming.
I mean, we were at university together. We did our masters together, and one very different aspect of my own experience, having been born in London, I would be immediately perceived as a Londoner, as a Brit, right? And you were there in the course, and I remember I think I did a module on, I think I called it Middle Eastern politics or something. And I remember whenever the Israel-Palestine question came up in the course, I'd sort of look to you as the reference. And also I was already aware of how people have to modulate their behavior to fit into different spaces. And I think you were always the kind of model for me and a few of our friends and colleagues there, of somebody who was able to deal with the questions with such grace and yet with such firm principle. And it I suppose brings us into a very different time. We're in a different time. That was 2003, 7 to 8, right? There's been a lot of change since then, and a lot of change in the way that Palestine has been treated internationally, the way that Palestinians are now treated in different parts of the world, including the UK, and the way in which Palestinians are having to integrate and to also position themselves in contestation of things to maintain their commitment to national liberation. I think there's an evolution that's political there, that exposes many of the contradictions in play in international order. So I wanted to get into some of those contradictions. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion, particularly among Western liberals, but not only, about the end of things, the end of liberal order or even neoliberal order, what that is, whether it's associated primarily with the American century or whether it's something that comes after the Cold War. And it does seem that there's been a radical fragmentation of the international system.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, it might not be that fragmentation that has fundamentally changed the situation for Palestinians and for Palestine. It might be that that's exposed some of the contradictions of the system, particularly in international law, etc. And what's been going on with the genocide since 2023 in particular seems to have revealed those contradictions in the most grotesque way. But I wanted to pose that question to both of you. How do you see the changing situation of Palestine in relation to this discussion of the end of order and fragmentation, or the end of unipolarity, or the emergence of a new kind of international order or even disorder? Maybe start with you, Tarek.
Well, I mean, I think that it's obviously gone through different iterations, and I think, as you say, we're in a different. We're in a new, in many ways, we're in a new reality, but also we're not, because the reality of the Nakba has been ongoing for, for the first Zionist arrival on Palestinian shores. So we're thinking about a century now. But there is a new reality that's happening in terms of how Palestine is disrupting the international order and showing it's making the contradictions that we always knew were there, especially in liberal Western democracies, unsustainable. And that was something that was already beginning to happen gradually. And I think it's happening on the global level. We're living in a moment of tectonic shifts in terms of American decline, in terms of some of the changes that are happening around China and Asia, and in terms of the war in Europe. And all of the sort of the global the global shift, the rise of global capitalism and the way that we're seeing it around tech, around big firms, the climate justice movement and what's happening. So there's a lot of shifts. There are tectonic shifts that have been happening for decades, and even after the end of the Cold War, the rise of American unipolarity. I think in many ways that's being contested now in ways that it hadn't been in the past 3 decades. But I think what Palestine has done is it almost burst open all of these trends that we knew were happening below the surface, and now it's impossible to unsee. To sort of have a genocide, the first live stream genocide in history, happen for it's ongoing. It's still happening more than 2 years after it started, with no ability to stop it, even though there's immense will. The level of mobilization, the level of popular contestation of this is unprecedented in many ways, and it's ongoing, and it just shows the complete inadequacy of our international systems, and it's sort of this idea that they can deliver things like justice or international law or any of those things. Now it's dead in the water. So these systems, the question is what to do with these systems, how to decolonize them, how they can be effective, how we can move into a more egalitarian future. But the reality is that these systems have failed, and they've been completely co-opted by Western hegemony, and the genocide sort of goes to the heart of that. It shows that you can't have these ideas that these institutions, specifically in the West, these so-called liberal institutions of the academy or media or judicial systems or any of those things, that they actually have that they actually abide by their values. They don't. Their values are proclaimed, but their reality is that they're still colonial institutions with a very racist ideology that connects, their realities in the West to their approval of and acceptance of the continued colonial project in Palestine, this sort of this link between Zionism and the Western liberal order. So in many ways, Palestine goes to the heart of that. And so the genocide in Gaza, I think, has exposed something that it's impossible to unsee or to go back from, which is that we're at a moment of crisis globally. And if we are thinking about a more just future, that future has to run through Jerusalem. There's no way around it. If Palestine isn't free, then these systems of colonialism, even in their Western liberal garb, will continue to exist the way they are.
Yeah, I want to stay on that point about the centrality of Palestine, and I think we can then come back to tactical decisions of the Palestinians and their struggle in relation to international structures. I think that's an important question as well. But Yara, maybe you also mentioned an experience of realizing that Palestine wasn't the center of the world, and at the same time, it does feel, as Tarek says, that centering Palestine and understanding Palestine as laboratory or Palestine as presage for a certain kind of future is not only important, but it's the only way to read what's going on in Palestine right now.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about Palestine, I mean, interesting and deeply sad things about Palestine is the level of global complicity. And that's what makes it central and key for so many reasons. There are so many states, actors, companies, individuals that are complicit in the mass slaughter that we've seen over the last 2 years, but also the decades that have led up to this. There is a reason why what has happened in the last 2 years has been allowed to happen. We're talking about decades of sort of prep work for this. And so that level of complicity makes it a global issue. It's not just about being a lab. It's not just, the Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, said that, Gaza is basically a rehearsal for what's going to happen in the rest of the world. And yeah, that is true. Certainly on a arms front, we know that the Israeli regime uses Gaza and has historically used Gaza and the West Bank, for that matter, as a test case for its weapons, as a sort of or a showcase for its weapons. When it goes to these big weapons fairs, they literally use pictures of the damage and destruction and slaughter in Gaza to show that their weapons actually work. And then, with the advent of AI generated, machinery and warfare, etc. So in that sense, I think it's true. But I think it's not just about that. It's about the sort of the very intimate and deep levels of complicity that seemingly like random companies will have, and people are doing great work to uncover all those really dark and nefarious relationships, and it stems from like pension funds to cooperatives to banks. It's just really widespread. But I also wanted to go back just to comment on what Tarek was saying. I think something about the last 2 years has been there's a tension for me between the shocking and the not shocking. I always say that the last 2 years has been shocking and not surprising. And by that I mean that like the level of death and destruction, every day I continue to be traumatized and shocked, and just I'm always asking myself how can we have allowed this to happen. But at the same time, I'm not surprised. Of course this has happened. Of course we've seen over a century of dehumanization of Palestinians, of displacement, of ethnic cleansing. Of course this was always going to be the end result. And so it's been, holding those two things at the same time is a tension that I try to wrap my head around. And I think also one of the reasons that I am determined to still be shocked by all of this is to not normalize it. This can't be normal. This can't be what we accept as a normal state of being. That Palestine is perpetually determined as this place of horror, of violence, because that's exactly what they want, what the other side wants. But then at the same time, I don't want us to be naive that this isn't this didn't happen because of October 7th. This didn't happen, just because it was a spark. This was always going to happen. I think genocide was always going to be an inevitable outcome of this settler colonial project.
Yeah, I think a tension here emerges between a need not to normalize and also a need not to exceptionalize, right?
Right.
Which I think is kind of encapsulated in the idea and the experience of catastrophe in Palestine. But then I suppose also we can relate that to a broader idea, imagination of catastrophe that's present beyond Palestine. And catastrophe is often thought of from the outside of particular experiences of it as something that happens from one day to next, a sort of an event, a catastrophic turning point. But the experience of catastrophe is catastrophe as structure and catastrophe as process. And engaging with that seriously, politically as well as intellectually, seems to be necessary to work out how to work through that tension between not normalizing and not exceptionalizing. One thing that I've been trying to do in relation to what's going on in Palestine is to think beyond the specific contextual factors of a colonial occupation, of any religious, ethno-national, political factors involved. How does what's going on in Palestine connect to global processes and materially connect to global processes? And it seems to me that Gaza in particular has been exemplary, or the treatment of Gaza and the destruction of Gaza has been exemplary of an impulse that exists now in much of contemporary capitalism. I say much of because you can't talk about just capitalism as a monolithic thing, but there has been over the last 40 years a process of precarious informalization that has occurred, starting on the periphery, and particularly informalization of labor, but not only, starting on the periphery, that has produced increasingly superfluous populations. Not when I say superfluous, I don't just mean surplus populations, those who might be waiting in the wings of the formal economy to be employed and then to be instrumentalized in the economy. Now, these are populations who no longer can be instrumental to regimes of accumulation. They are marginal, quite literally. And this is actually not only a phenomenon now that exists on the periphery of global capitalism. It exists increasingly in the so-called advanced economies after the financial crisis. And I think it's actually contributing to much of the political turbulence and the crises of hegemony that we see in many countries across the West. But looking at Gaza has become, the population of Gaza have become, it seems to me, increasingly dependent on Israeli circuits of capital as well as foreign aid, while Israel has increasingly employed cheaper labor, imported cheaper labor, often using bonded labor even, which means that Palestinians in Gaza have become less instrumental to Israeli regimes of accumulation. And that there's therefore a kind of impulse towards not just the expulsion, but ultimately the eradication of this superfluous population. What is superfluous cannot be managed. It needs to be excised systemically. And I think this is the impulse against which we need to be fighting globally. And I suppose this connects us to questions of internationalism and international solidarity, how to connect what's going on in Palestine, centering Palestine, but de-exceptionalizing it in that way, and understanding that there is an element of what's going on in Palestine that might well be relevant to other struggles elsewhere, other genocides elsewhere indeed. That is not placing Palestine in the abstract sense as a laboratory, but in fact is seeing really what is going on through technological warfare, all the complex of actors involved. And when I say a complex of actors, we're not just talking about Israel's military industrial complex, its tech companies supported by the US and other international actors, but we're talking about private military firms, we're talking about security companies, we're talking about big tech, we're talking about management consultancies, and we're talking about even NGOs that might have been campaigning in different ways, sometimes equivocally, but campaigning nonetheless against genocide and in the name of human life and survival, but have had relations with all these other vanguard actors. I say vanguard because these are the actors that are at the vanguard, I believe, of this global tendency or global impulse towards genocide. So I thought maybe we could come on to questions of how to struggle, fight against these tendencies globally while still centering Palestine. Now we're in South Africa, a country that for many years was under an apartheid regime, and the struggle against apartheid and against different forms of oppression expressed through apartheid was also a struggle that involved people around the world. And it was obviously a very different time, and solidarity had a kind of different meaning. But we now need to go back to questions of how to exercise solidarity, and we've reflected a bit on this together about what solidarity might look like today, how it can be most effective, or how it's already being enacted. Difference between expressing solidarity and acting in solidarity. Yara, you've spoken in the past about transactional solidarities and ideological solidarities. So maybe we can elaborate on that, Yara, starting with you.
Yeah, and when you were talking, I was thinking that you were describing very well the difference between settler colonialism and colonialism. And it's really important that we, understand the context that we're fighting and struggling within. The Israeli regime is a settler colonial regime. And that frame of analysis helps us understand what they want to do with us. And quite simply, they want to eliminate us. They want to erase us in various different ways. Now, whether that's sort of um, encaging us in outdoor prisons, whether that's, fully displacing us and ethnically cleansing us, whether it's, erasing us into these tiny little ghettos or bantustans in the 48 territories. But that definition is really important because it tells us what the end game for the Israeli regime is. And the end game is no Palestinians on the land of Palestine. And they are slowly, practicing the technique of as many Palestinians on as little land as possible. And we see that, in Gaza and in the West Bank and in the 48 territories. In the West Bank is completely divided up into these tiny pockets of supposed Palestinian Authority control. The reality is limited amounts of autonomy. And now Gaza has been cut into two. And the majority of the population is in less than 50% of what was Gaza previous to the genocide, living in complete ruin. And definitions are important and frameworks of analysis are important because it helps us understand what we're up against and what we're struggling for. But also it de-exceptionalizes the Israeli regime. And so we talk about the de-exceptionalization of Palestine, but I think it's really important that we talk about the de-exceptionalization of Israel. They love to think that they are, this exceptional, remarkable project, when actually they're just a poor copy of a lot of other projects that have happened around the world. You look at their rhetoric, especially in the early days of Zionism, it was literally copy pasting from other settler colonial projects. There was no originality there whatsoever. And even their tactics, and even their, legal system, the way that they've set up the apartheid system in Palestine, it's all copied from previous colonial and current colonial projects. And I think when you de-exceptionalize Israel, it also helps us build connections with other communities, other groups of people that are also struggling against settler colonial domination. And I think just to move on to the point about solidarity, transactional versus ideological solidarity. I think what we see a lot of times on social media, on public platforms, is a very shallow form of solidarity. And I don't think it's always intentional. I think we collectively have a lot of unlearning to do in terms of what, true solidarity looks like, and also a lot of learning. Palestinians, but also I think this applies to a lot of people around the world, have gone through a process of deep depoliticization. I think the advent of social media has also not helped. People look at Palestine now and think of it as a trend. And that's not to dismiss the massive mobilization we've seen and the massive outpouring of support. But I think quite a lot of time it does lack political depth. And I think it's great that people feel inherently that, some kind of inherent affiliation with Palestine, or sort of they feel naturally um, supportive of Palestine. But I think there has to be a lot of work done to politicize that kind of support, because that's what maintains the struggle. That's what creates longevity and also creates real connections with other struggles. I mean, do people know why they support Palestine politically? Do people know why they're against the genocide in Sudan politically? Apart from, okay, we're, against mass slaughter and violence, but it needs to go further than that. It needs to be connected to a larger political project,
Mm.
because otherwise it risks remaining at this very sort of shallow social media level of solidarity.
I think one way of putting it would be solidarity as an act needs to be connected to some sort of collective horizon and
Right.
some project, and that project can be either a national project or it can be an international project, and I think it should be both, right? It should be a project that is international and internationalist, but connected to national struggles.
And I would say,
Yeah.
just on the flip side as well, that I do think the genocide has radicalized a lot of people.
Mm, mm,
I would say that, like, and I don't like talking about, you know, things in terms of generations, but I will just to make this point that, the younger generation that I'm seeing, talking about Palestine, they're talking about Palestine in a way that I was not talking about Palestine at
mm.
that age. So I do think that the genocide has changed things for a lot of people and is reversing that sort of depoliticization process. And I think the fact that, the level of global complicity is helping people understand this as part of a larger political struggle.
Yeah, I mean, that relates very much, what you've said in general in this last block relates very much to some of my own experiences with international solidarity. I grew up in international solidarity campaigns with Latin America. My parents were very involved in solidarity with Chile. And over the years, particularly into my adult life, I started to try to engage with that experience more politically and critically as well, and understand that although those campaigns were formed in the aftermath of the mobilization of movements and organizations that had a horizon that was transformative, was to transcend capitalism and to transcend the systems in which they were living in Latin America. The campaigns themselves were often also expressive of a kind of post-revolutionary protest politics that then embraced the language of human rights, and human rights as an instrument to try to counter the regimes of torture and disappearance and assassination. But that became a sort of abstract discourse that disconnected people a lot of the time from the material basis of acts of solidarity. Solidarity became much more of an expression, something that you can do with people across territories, across borders, but doesn't necessarily need to be rooted in the experience and the struggles that you yourself are engaged in. It becomes almost necessarily a much more middle class act as well. Not something rooted in the experience of work and the unfreedoms that experience produces. And I think with the politicization and radicalization that's happened with young people in respect to Palestine, it seems to me that there's also something that's very much of our time in the last, let's say, 15 years or so, that has produced a kind of contradictory anti-political tendency that means that while people are politicizing, they often don't have a substantive content to that politics.
Mhm.
And that can be quite risky, quite dangerous, because it means people can go in different ways, and the radicalization can push in ways that really are quite counter eventually to the struggles in which they might be involved for a particular moment. I suppose that goes back to the question of how to through organization connect or build solidarity into an internationalist project. And maybe you can reflect on that, Tariq. What the connections between internationalism as it's required today and solidarity as it's being enacted.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're living in a very interesting moment because I think this is in some ways the neoliberal project and late stage capitalism has created such atomization
Mm.
and depoliticization that people often exist on individual levels, not in communal levels, not in collectives, not in sort of political realms that engage some of their beliefs or some of their values. And so solidarity either gets performative or it gets sort of detached from anything that's material. I mean, it can be, solidarity expressed as a view on social media or as sending money to a humanitarian cause in Gaza, but it doesn't build beyond that. And it almost looks like it can happen on the level of the individual, and it's almost detached from the space that individual finds themselves in. So I always think about this quote that Ala Abdel Fattah, who is a former political prisoner in Egypt, writing about what can one do to be supportive of Palestine, so to sort of engage, to be an ally for Palestine. And he said, fight for democracy in your home.
Mm.
Fight for work on the values that would emancipate Palestine in the space that you're sitting in. And I think this is really important. This is, I think, how I try to straddle this internationalist sort of spectrum, because obviously there's immediate solidarity with Palestine. That's also material. That's about fighting Zionism. That's about disrupting institutions or all forms of complicity. That's about undoing this infrastructure that is enabling the continuation of the colonization of Palestine in whatever form that takes in one's vicinity. So there's something that's specific to Palestine, but those forces of colonization are interconnected and interwoven. So that if you're fighting against, the military-industrial complex in the U.S., you're fighting for Palestine,
Mm.
right? And thinking about how you push the struggle for indigenous rights in the U.S., how to think about decolonization in the U.S., these established settler colonies, that's the way to fight for Palestine.
Mm.
Because this is what, I mean, Zionism is the flip side of that. It's basically saying, look, all of these settler colonies, Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, they're established, they succeeded, they sort of eradicated indigenous communities, and this is what we want to do in Palestine. And what Palestinians are saying is actually, no, you haven't eradicated all of your indigenous communities. They still have rights. We want to talk about reparations. We want to talk about decolonization. And if we push a successful struggle in Palestine, it brings up the question of the sustainability of these settler colonial regimes. And so this is how they're interconnected. It's not to say that they're the same struggle, but it's to say that they're fighting the same ideologies, right? Or different manifestations of the same ideologies. And so I think straddling the national, international is about thinking, in many ways, it's about thinking about the limits of analogy. We're sitting in South Africa. Palestine isn't going to free itself the way South Africa freed itself from
Right.
apartheid. But so there's a limit to this analogy, but understanding these frameworks help us then understand Palestine in its specificity, South Africa in its specificity, and understand that there's something that speaks to each other. These are similar regimes, ideologies that we're fighting, and therefore our projects of emancipation can also speak
Mm.
to each other. So it's I guess what I'm trying to say is it's both very specific in
Mm.
context, but also placed in an internationalist framing, and it's about straddling that divide.
That's something that I often talk about when people come to me and feel very overwhelmed and ask me about, they don't know what to do for Palestine, right? They've been on all these protests, they've given money to various humanitarian organizations, all things which are incredibly important and meaningful. But then they feel overwhelmed because the reality on the ground hasn't changed for Palestinians, or it's changed in a very minimal way. And as Tariq said, like the important thing is to think about your political context, because that in turn will have a real material outcome for Palestine. So, just to take the UK example, are people also organizing, in addition to going on protests, giving money to humanitarian organizations, are they also looking to build a new political project in which Palestine will naturally be Palestinian liberation would be part of that political project. Some people are, but a lot of people on those marches, well, we've seen millions of people go on those marches continuously in the UK. I mean, the UK has been one of the places, and London specifically has been one of the places where people have shown up for Palestine on the streets in a continuous manner for the last 2 years. But are those people being mobilized into a larger political project at
Right.
home? And, I know there are, of course, efforts to do so. But I think people aren't necessarily making that link that, what is needed is a change in regimes around the world for even
Right.
anything to move significantly in Palestine. And on the one hand, it sounds overwhelming, that everything everywhere in the world has to change for Palestinian liberation. But then on the other hand, it feels a lot more tangible, like it's something that people can do in their own context at home. Um, and this is something that is a long-term project. It's not a short-term project. This is something that took me a long time to come to terms with, that I might not see a free Palestine in my lifetime.
Mm.
I think I will, but I also have to be okay with the idea that I might not see that. And that this is a long process. This is something that we're going to be working on for generations. And that's, why it's called struggle, I guess. But it's, and I think there is a level of impatience because we've been waiting for this for so long. This is, we're talking nearly, over 100 years where we've been under Zionist domination. And so I understand the impulse to, and it's taxing, like it's, and you're talking to two Palestinians who are also incredibly privileged compared to
Right.
the most of our people. And so there is that sort of desire for things to, for quick, short-term solutions, but we can't, we can't think like that. We're in it for the long game.
And there's something reflecting. I don't want to be too UK centric here, but seeing as you both mentioned that moment in 2003 that was a key politicizing or even radicalizing moment for you. Thinking how to overcome the atomism of contemporary political mobilization or political organization, and then to think beyond sort of the insubstance of politics and hyperpolitics today that is very present in younger generations in particular, who are being politicized, who are being radicalized. I think we can look at those two moments, and they involved a lot of young people, right? School children in 2003, and I say those moments, 2003. I'm referring then also to the moment of the protests against student fees. I think that was another generational moment in the UK, a very different cause, not an international cause. But I think both of those can be seen as moments that then weren't turned into more cohesive and substantial political projects. Right? There was, coming out of the protests against Iraq, a broad feeling of resentment about Britain propping up the US or supporting the US in its rush to war, and a feeling of sentiment against war, an anti-war sentiment that I think continued for quite some time. It then ebbed. With respect to the student fees, that was a moment that led to the creation of a few new initiatives, but ultimately that battle was lost, and we've not gone back and we've not won it since. So I think beyond organizing people, there's also a question about building stuff, and building a project requires also building institutions and building infrastructure. When we think about the necessary or strategic ambivalence, a phrase that you've used, Tarek, in relation to international legal structures and frameworks. And then we look at the big companies that are at the vanguard, not just that are agents, not of just genocide in Palestine, but of this tendency towards genocide or towards exclusion more generally. I think we also need to think about the infrastructures that we can produce that are alternative to those, from big tech and trying to claim sovereignty over data infrastructure and digital infrastructure, to thinking about the way in which people are organized in their current conditions of labor, whether that's informalized labor, not only formal labor, which has usually been organized through unions. But then the big question for us is, how do we finance that? Because liberation is a political project, it's a political struggle, but it has its own political economy. And I think thinking through those alternatives will be really crucial over this next period in centering Palestine within an internationalist project. I think maybe if you'd both like to offer some final reflections on that theme, alternatives, infrastructure, but anything else that we've talked about through this conversation.
Yeah.
Tarek first.
Well, I mean, in your this question and the one you put out before about, especially the younger generation, but people generally feeling like they're not necessarily held in their entry into politics, that they're sort of entering into this politics maybe through Gaza, their mask is ripped, they're beginning to understand something, and there isn't a container through which they can express their solidarity or through which they can express their commitment to a different future. And I think about that a lot. And I think, this idea of building an infrastructure, an internationalist infrastructure, is extremely important. I mean, I think that the way that we've lost, maybe it is the depoliticization that Yara was talking about, but I think that we've lost, certainly on the left, the ability to really come back into an ideology that is grounding, and that we can then, from which we can start to build an organizational infrastructure that can hold all of these different struggles, and educate people how they are connected. This sort of process of political education, all of the people who are looking at what's happening in horror. Um, there's horror and there's rage, and both of these are in many ways productive emotions, but they're not necessarily going to lead to sustainable change unless they're channeled into some kind of vehicle that can contain them. And I really think that there's a way for us to look at our global history, specifically the decolonial, sort of the anti-colonial movements of the past century, and thinking about how they educated their cadres, how they built commitment, how they enabled their fighters to think about the long-term struggle and to survive that, and to sort of ground their strategic work and their political interventions in ideology, so that when you come to these institutions, whether it's media or the law or whatever it is, you're not just reactive, you're dealing with them from a place of a very clear ideological and ethical center. And that's how you decide how to engage with these institutions. And then how you decide to build power. Power that, obviously power corrupts in many ways, but also on the left and for Palestine, we need power.
Right.
And so how do you protect against the corruptions of power? And I think this is where ideology comes. So for me, when I think about the building this internationalist infrastructure, in many ways, it's political education, it's ideology, it's showing the interconnectedness of these struggles as we're showing their specificities, and providing a container that can hold rage, that can hold horror, and translate that into strategic work. And there's very few places where that's happening, where I can sort of look at very deliberate, very systemic developing of a cadre on the left that's able to have that internationalist framework. And I think it's a result of the past century, some of the failures of these sort of internationalist thinkers and revolutionaries, um, and the success of Western hegemony and the colonial model, which continues to our day. And so, how do we resuscitate that revolutionary legacy and sort of bring it into the 21st century? I think that's the question of our time, and I think Gaza is sort of putting its finger on that question.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of challenges and opportunities for internationalism in this moment. I mean, if you think about the heyday of internationalism, and I, I I mean, I definitely have a tendency to think about that time with nostalgia. Um, and if you sort of compare it to now, where we've become more individualized. we're bigger consumers. We want everything now, and we want, you know, uh, we consume information in a very different way. It has to be instant. It has to be short. It has to be on social media. It has to be
Yeah.
visual. So things have changed monumentally. Even just even in the last few years, like if we think about the what we're seeing online and AI, and it's very overwhelming, and it presents a lot of challenges. Security, one of the biggest challenges that we face. We're in a world where we are constantly surveilled and followed, and it's created an atmosphere of distrust and suspicion, in so many different spaces. I mean, i- is a private meeting any more a private meeting? Can you ever be sure that, what you're saying, talking about with comrades is, truly secure? So, we face a lot of challenges, and it's difficult to think how we overcome them because Juliana, you mentioned that, we need money as well. Like that's one of the biggest issues facing a kind of, renewed political project. The sort of the forces against us are just they're billionaires, they own everything. They literally own the world, and we own nothing. But then I also think that there are opportunities. Um, we are in a time where we are able to connect with more people and in a much easier way. I mean, it, I think we take this for granted that we can, immediately talk with someone on the other side of the world. Something is happening to them that is connected to us, some company, some arms company that, has been selling weapons to the Israeli regime has also been, selling weapons to some other nasty regime somewhere else. And we can immediately connect with those people. The fact that we can, have access to communities around the world, I think presents a lot of opportunities for us to actually build and think about something alternative. But we also do have to think about how we address those challenges of resources, of massive surveillance. And there are efforts being done. There are different groups, subversive groups, that are trying to find ways around, all of these challenges that we're facing. But I'm not going to lie, like I feel incredibly overwhelmed in this moment. Um, I think the genocide has had a really um, devastating impact on our ability as Palestinians to organize and to think politically. And it goes without saying, obviously, that the material consequences have just been horrific. But I think it's also had an impact on the movement more broadly. We've been forever changed by this, and I think it's for those of us outside of Gaza. I think we cannot succumb to those feelings of being totally overwhelmed and devastated because we don't have that luxury.
Yeah, I think that's one of the central political challenges now in relation to Palestine, but in relation to all sorts of struggles around the world. Catastrophe encourages a sort of fatalistic resignation, and overcoming that tendency towards resignation is key.
Right. Mm.
Imagination is key to the project of building a new internationalism that can divert from catastrophe, create other pathways. And at the same time, there already is a collective imagination that has emerged over the last decade and a half, probably, which is a catastrophic imagination, and it's present in our art and in our culture and in our theory. And it's not just us individually sitting around imagining things that's going to change the world. We don't produce new futures by individually imagining possibilities. A collective imagination emerges from new material circumstances. And so it is the organizing, it is the development of infrastructure. It is finding ways to overcome the challenges of political economy that present themselves to the struggles that we've discussed. That doesn't mean that conversations can't contribute to those. And I think conversations, when they're strategic, can and should be part of that process of organizing, reflecting critically in the moments that are important to struggle. And I hope that this conversation in some way has contributed to that. It's been a really great pleasure to be here with you both. And I thank you so much for your time, Tarek, Yara. I hope we can do it again soon. And I thank you all for listening, for tuning in. Please continue to engage with Ashabaka and the work that they're doing with my two colleagues here and with Alameda. And we hope that the connections between these organizations and the struggles that we've been discussing today can also provide some inspiration for others to get involved in mobilizing to overcome the problems that we've discussed. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Juliana.
Thank you.